What's going on, guys? Tanner Shapiro Visuals here again with another video about cameras. Today we're going to talk about types of sensors throughout various cameras, what they do, why you should care, and which ones you should invest your money into. The sensor is the most important part of your camera. It's what light exposes onto in order to create your image. It's also where your megapixels are located, and it's where those megapixels take in that light in order to turn it into an image. I know you've all heard of megapixels before, but what you don't really hear about often is sensor size. And that actually, in most cases, makes more difference in the quality of a photo than how many megapixels there are. Here I have my Sony a7 II again. If I take off the lens, that's the sensor. You want to be careful when you take your lens off your mirrorless camera because your sensor is completely exposed. And the thing is, you can get dirt on your sensor and that'll directly affect what your photos look like, and it's not going to be good. So here's the most basic and general way to explain sensor sizes. The bigger your sensor, generally the better quality your photo is going to be, and the better it will perform in low light scenarios. Now again, that's general. That's not to say that there isn't a crop sensor camera that performs better than a full frame camera in low light. But generally, full frame is going to perform better than a crop sensor or something even smaller than a crop sensor like a micro four thirds sensor. So the sensor is the part of your camera the light exposes onto in order to get an image. Simple enough, right? Sort of, but there's a little more to it. Full-frame sensors are equivalent to the size of a 35mm film exposure. They're the most commonly used among professional photographers. Crop sensors are about 60% of the size of a full-frame sensor. The camera bodies for crop sensors are often smaller and cost less than the full-frame counterpart. Micro Four Thirds is kind of a direct competitor to crop sensors, but it is a little smaller. You find that in camera brands like Olympus and Lumix. 1-inch sensors are used on high-end point-and-shoots, and I use high-end loosely, like the Sony ZV-1. Any sensor smaller than that you're going to see in a cheap point-and-shoot camera or the sensor in your phone. So out of those sensors that I've mentioned, which one is the best? Well, that's kind of an ongoing debate, so keep in mind that everything going forward in this video that I have to say about sensors is purely based on my experience. Your experience could differ. Another thing that we need to talk about is megapixels. A common misconception is that the more megapixels, the better. But that's not really true either. For example, let's compare the crop sensor Sony a6100 to the full-frame Sony a7 III. These cameras both have 24 megapixels across their sensor. But the a7 III has a physically bigger sensor. What a lot of people don't know is that megapixels can differ in size. The megapixels on the a7 III, they each take up more surface area on the sensor, meaning they can take in more data and more light. The more megapixels you have, the higher resolution your photo is going to be. And that's within reason. What I mean by that is I know you have seen advertisements for certain like phone cameras that have a shit ton of megapixels. The phone I'm thinking of in particular is the Samsung Galaxy S20. They made a huge deal about having a 108 megapixel phone camera. Those phone camera sensors are so small, it doesn't matter how many megapixels you shove onto it, it's not going to make a difference at that sensor size. My 24 megapixel a7 II is going to take a higher resolution photo than that 108 megapixel Samsung Galaxy S20. And I've used the S20 myself. It's a gimmick. Total gimmick to cell phones. Let's talk about lenses and the crop factor. So another thing that many people don't know is that there are certain lenses engineered to work on certain types of sensors. We're pretty much only going to talk about crop sensors and full frame sensors here because that's what most people are buying. If you're buying an interchangeable lens camera, you're going to need to buy a lens as well. Like I said, something that people don't know is that there are crop sensor lenses and full frame lenses. That's because there are allowances in the back of the lens cut out in order to shine an adequate amount of light onto the sensor. Back to my Sony a7 II. I have a 35mm prime lens on it. If I take it off here, you can see the hole in the back of the lens is cut out to pretty much the exact same size as the sensor in the camera. This ensures that adequate light is being shined onto the sensor. Now let's look at my Rebel XS. You can see that it has a crop sensor. It's much smaller compared to that 35mm sensor. This is a crop sensor lens for a Canon crop sensor camera. You can see that the allowance in the back is a circle. This is not going to shine an adequate amount of light onto a full frame sensor. So keep in mind, you can use a full frame lens on a crop sensor camera because the hole in the back will shine enough light to cover the entirety of the crop sensor. But if you do it the other way around and you try to use a crop sensor lens on a full frame camera, there won't be enough light to shine across the whole sensor. So you can't use it without actually going into what some cameras have is a crop mode, and they'll only use part of the sensor, but that completely defeats the purpose of having a full frame camera. What I always recommend to do if you're tired of using your kit lens on your crop sensor camera is to buy a full frame lens, so if you ever upgrade camera bodies later on to a full frame camera, you can continue to use that lens instead of buying like a higher end crop sensor lens and then not being able to use it later. Now let's talk about what the crop factor is. That's going to directly affect the focal length of your image. The simplest way to explain it is if you use a full frame lens on a crop sensor camera, your focal length is going to be magnified by about 1.5 times. If I were to use this 35mm lens on a Sony a6000 or a6100, which are crop sensor cameras, it wouldn't actually show up as a 35mm focal length on the camera. It'd be more like a 50mm equivalent. So if you're buying a new camera, why go smaller than full frame? I mean, if that's the best, then why would you do anything less? Cost is the #1 reason, really. Let's take a look back at that A7 III. Just the body of the camera costs $2,000 normally. Compare that to Sony's highest end crop sensor camera, the Sony a6600. The a6600 has every single feature that the A7 III has. The only difference is that it has a crop sensor. The a6600 on its own, just the body, costs $1,400. So there's a $600 difference there, and that's literally just the sensor. They're essentially the same camera in terms of features, meaning same battery size, same autofocus system, same 4K video, same menu system, same everything, except the sensor is just smaller. The other benefit of having the smaller sensor is having an even smaller camera body, which a lot of people like. The a6600 normally retails with a lens for about $1,800. So for less than just the camera body of the a7 III, you can get a 6600 and a lens, and you can start shooting. That just kind of shows you the cost difference of a full frame versus a crop sensor camera. What does this all mean, and how does it all relate to what camera you should get? If you've been shooting photography like on your phone and you want to take a step up and use a real camera, get a crop sensor camera, especially if you want to save a little money. That's actually the point where you're going to see a huge difference between the quality of like your phone's camera and then a real camera. If you have a lot of money and you're rich, then go ahead and get a full frame. They work in the exact same way. If you're learning correctly, you'll be shooting in manual. You're still going to be changing your shutter, your aperture, and your ISO the same way you would on any camera. It's just one camera has a bigger sensor, one camera has a smaller sensor. If you are thinking of getting into photography and you don't want to, break the bank because you're not sure if this is a hobby you're going to want to pursue forever, then don't get a full frame camera. Get a crop sensor camera first with a cheap full frame lens and see how you like it. And then a couple years down the road, then you should buy your full frame camera. You already know what you're doing, you know how to shoot photos, and you're going to utilize the entire extent of that full frame sensor. So anyway, thanks for watching. I hope you know about sensors now. If you don't, you can dislike the video, and I will never make a video again. As always, my name is Tanner, and I'll be back next week with another video. This next one coming up is going to be a little different, so I hope you guys like it. Anyway, see you in a week. Bye.